Uh, I'm thrilled to welcome you all today at the end of January for what promises to be a momentous year for our communities. I'm Karthik Ramakrishnan, founder and executive director of AAPI Data. We have a very special guest today, Chair Grace Meng, from Chair of the Congressional APA Caucus. I'm just going to read her bio very quickly. We're going to hear remarks about not just what she's thinking, but what CAPAC, which is an important partner for many of the community organizations that we work with. So let me just say a little bit about Grace Meng. U.S. Congresswoman Grace Meng is serving her seventh term in the U.S. House of Representatives, where she represents New York's 6th congressional district. Her district is located entirely in the New York City borough of Queens, including West, Central, and Northeast Queens. Grace is the first and only Asian American member of Congress from New York State and the first female Congress member from Queens since former vice presidential nominee Geraldine Ferraro. Congresswoman Meng has proudly passed several pieces of legislation into law. In order to combat the rise in hate and violence that increased during the coronavirus pandemic, she passed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act into law. Further, she helped reduce long processing times for passports, secured millions of dollars for a congressional district, and has worked to combat mail theft. At every turn, Congresswoman Meng has fought to expand opportunities for communities of color, young people, families, small businesses, and women. And that's just tip of the iceberg. And we know Congresswoman Meng, and especially in her role as the chair of the Congressional APA Caucus, that has been such a tireless champion for so many issues in our community. Welcome, Congresswoman Meng.
Thank you so much, Karthik. Thank you for those kind words, and to all of you for AAPI Data and Kappa, AAJA, APIA Vote, and everyone who's on the Zoom today. Thank you for hosting the Voices of Community webinar series. We know too well that Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders are not a monolith. And as the fastest growing racial demographic in the United States, it is imperative that we understand the different and diverse perspectives of our community. And that's why this survey series is so important, because this data helps us understand where our community is and how we can best help them through policy change. Right now, I don't have to tell anyone on this call, our communities are hurting. We have heard time and time again that families from coast to coast are struggling to make ends meet. In fact, this survey data shows us that the majority of AA and HPI adults expect the national economy to get worse in 2026. I myself just came from a meeting in my own district of some of our leaders and executive directors of our Asian American groups, and they anecdotally shared with me so much of what this data and survey proves. Given the administration's attacks on affordable healthcare, I know rising healthcare premiums, in addition to the skyrocketing cost of living, are making it harder for our families to survive and to thrive. Thanks to the work of AAPI Data, we can see just how much pressure these costs are putting on our communities' backs. Half of AA and HPI adults report that the cost of living or inflation is a major priority for them. 56% of AA and HPI adults report that healthcare costs are the most difficult item to afford. But it's not just about affordability. A and HPI adults are worried about their freedoms in this nation, with the majority viewing key rights like freedom of speech and freedom of press under threat. At a time when federal immigration officials are targeting law-abiding members of our community and shooting protesters exercising their First Amendment rights, this fear is well-founded. That's why CAPAC is working tirelessly to ensure Congress acts to address the pressing concerns of our AA and HPI community, including defending our civil rights and liberty and making America a better place for future generations. Last year, our caucus released our policy framework for the 119th Congress, which guides KPAC in fighting for and executing on legislative priorities. These priorities include supporting thriving families and communities, advancing equity and defending our rights, and promoting economic opportunity for all. And they guided our fight for legislation to extend the ACA tax credits, to hold federal agents accountable for their unlawful actions, and to codify protections for language access for our communities. The work is nowhere near done, but with this survey data and your support, we will continue the fight for better representation and policy for AAPIs nationwide. Thank you to everyone for joining us today, including our community leaders. Thank you during what I know is an especially painful time for many of our community members. But your work is truly making a difference for our community. And I just wanted to say thank you again.
Thank you so much, Chair Meng. And yes, I mean, there's so much going on in our communities and in Congress, given the dire situation. One thing I should note is, many of this data they were collected in December, so keep that in mind, team, because it's likely that that some of the findings are probably even more stark when it comes to some of those freedoms. We'll be working with NCAPA, the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, to add additional questions on immigration, on various rights under threat in an upcoming survey. Final thing I'll say is we know Congresswoman Meng and many other members of Congress, our friends at KPAC, they pay attention to these survey data. So I just want to just thank you for having an evidence-informed view of where our community is at, what our priorities are, and making sure that those needs are being addressed. So thank you, Congresswoman Meng, for joining us and appreciate the partnership as always. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So we have Sarah Sadhwani, who will be moderating, as giving her expert moderation as usual. Sarah, over to you.
Of course. Thanks so much, Karthik, and welcome to all. It looks like we have a phenomenal group of attendees, nearly 100 people joining us today in this critical moment. We absolutely are in dire times to hear about the data that will be presented. Welcome to everyone to this month's Voices of AAPI community briefing with the critical insights that we can offer on timely policy issues impacting our nation. My name is Sarah Sadhwani. I am now an associate professor at Pomona College and also a senior researcher at AAPI Data. Many thanks to Congresswoman Meng for being here with us today. But I'd also like to thank our partners, of course, AAPI Data, but also APIA Vote, the Asian American Journalists Association, and NCAPA for today's briefing, and the Associated Press and NORC for their ongoing partnership. The Voices of AAPI briefings are an incredibly important resource of data and insights for our communities regarding timely policy and social issues. As we heard the Congresswoman say, this is data that they are using on the ground to inform the kinds of decisions that they are making today. I am absolutely thrilled to be welcoming our speakers today, which we'll hear from a little bit later. Bob Sakaniwa from the APIA Vote, Director of Policy and Advocacy, as well as Greg Orton from the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, as we all know as NCAPA. With that, I'd like to bring Karthik back onto the stage. Karthik Ramakrishnan, our founder and executive director of AAPI Data, is going to review the main findings of the survey that we have today.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And I should note, folks, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat so that our moderator as well as panelists can look at that and we can address them all at the end of the session. So I'm just going to have a couple of announcements for AAPI data, and we're going to do something a little bit different before we jump into the survey findings. One is API Data is excited to launch Boulder Futures Summit, which in California, which is a new initiative. Boulder Futures, you'll hear more about it in the coming year. This summit brings together young people as well as elders and folks of all generations, but especially when it comes to younger Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and these are those aged 16 to 34. We'll be helping them develop a manifesto for the future of California to build a vision for a very different future for the state and country. That QR code will get you to the RSVP and registration with a deadline at the end of this month. And we'll be sharing that to all webinar attendees in our summary email as well. Next slide, please. So this is just a bit more about Boulder Futures. We're excited to share more details about this as the work proceeds. But please either register if you are a young person or someone who cares about the future of young people, and we'll be sharing that link and publicity in our email following the webinar as well. Next slide. About this survey itself, you can find our report with the Associated Press and NORC on our website. This is the QR code for the survey page where you can find all of the findings that we'll be presenting today. You can also find our surveys now from our main page. If you just go to apidata.com, you will see a handy button at the top where you click on it and you can see not only this survey, but other surveys that we have conducted over the last couple of years. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to try something a little bit new. So not only we're going to be presenting survey findings, we want to learn a bit more about you, our audience. So we're going to initiate a webinar poll with 2 questions that'll pop up. So I'm going to ask our team if you can start that first survey. So here are 2 questions in this survey. And the reason why we want to ask this is we want to see where our audience is compared to where Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are overall in the findings that we will present. So we'll give this about 20 more seconds. So please register your answers and we will close the poll. Okay, I'll count down from 5. So register your answers if you haven't yet. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so let's end the poll and let's share the results. So these are fascinating. So freedom of speech and freedom of press, pretty high. In our survey, we did not ask about freedom from unreasonable search and seizure this time around. We had asked about it in our survey with AP-NORC last year, and this is a question we will be sure to include in our future survey with NCAPA in a couple of months. So it makes sense that freedom from unreasonable search and seizure would be quite high, especially given the context of what's going on today. We also see when it comes to rights, a lot of concern about the right to assemble peacefully is under threat, but also the right to equal protection under the law. So this is something, thank you for filling this out. We get to know your hopes, but also concerns through questions like these. And it'll help us as we develop more questions in future surveys. Next slide, please. So what are some of the key findings from our most recent survey report? Next slide. First, I'll just say a bit about the methods. This is a national probability sample built on the Amplify AAPI panel that is administered by NORC at the University of Chicago. Our fielding dates were in early December, and the languages supported were in English, Mandarin, Cantonese, Vietnamese, and Korean. We had over 1,000 completes, and the overall margin of error is plus or minus 4.7 points. Next slide. So in terms of the key findings overall in the survey, affordability and cost of living are top of mind for API adults. Economy and personal finances are the key priorities for the coming year among Republicans as well as Democrats, with 72% mentioning at least one economic issue and 42% mentioning personal finances. Half cite inflation or the cost of living as a major priority. API adults are also pessimistic about the coming year. Most think that the national economy and how things are going overall will get worse in 2026. Concerns about healthcare costs and access are prevalent. So when it comes to health issues, it's the cost that's the biggest concern among Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Next slide. Immigration remains a high priority. I should note that this survey was conducted in December of 2024, and it's likely going to be higher now, right, given what's happening in Minneapolis and elsewhere. API adults are more likely than the general population to see key freedoms under threat. And then finally, we asked some questions about American identity and what Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders see as essential to US identity. And we'll say a bit more about that. But essentially, API adults see civic ideals as much more important to American identity than cultural notions of what it means to be American. This is a big fight that is going on within the conservative movement right now. And it's something to pay attention to as we move forward this year, not only given the elections at the end of the year, but the fact that this is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the founding of America. Next slide. So first are some questions about the future direction of the country. And what we find is that APIs are pessimistic about the future of the country in terms of the national economy and the way that things are going on in the country overall. So you see 58%, right, when it comes to the national economy, say that the national economy will get somewhat worse or much worse in the coming year. And the way things are going on in the country overall, 60% say that it's going to get somewhat worse or much worse. When it comes to the national economy, on both of those indicators, you see some improvement. So the fear was a lot greater in April of 2025 than in December of last year, but it's still heightened. It's well over a majority, and it's much higher than it was in December of 2023 under the Biden administration. Next slide. So in terms of top priorities into the coming year, you see inflation and cost of living as the top priority and concern among AAPIs. And it's much higher than the US average, right? So you get about a majority, 49%, citing inflation and cost of living, whereas only a third of the US population overall. So that's something important to pay attention to. Might be related to the fact that APIs are more likely to live in metropolitan areas with high housing costs and other costs of living. It's also possible that tariffs and tariff anxieties and disruptions too, especially when it comes to shopping in ethnic grocery stores, makes it more visible to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders than the general population. Importantly, though, inflation and cost of living is high not only among API Democrats, but also among Republicans and independents. You see the other issues. Immigration remains as high as it was this year as last year. And you see healthcare costs as it gets built into cost of living as something that pops up this year that wasn't as much of an issue as last year. Let's go to the next slide. So API Democrats are more likely than API Republicans to name inflation and cost of living, but even among Republicans, you see that 41% named this as a top priority. Next slide. So we'll go a little deep dive into the cost of living when it comes to personal finances. When you look by race and ethnicity, you see similar findings across the board with two notable exceptions. Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, which prior research has pointed out are more likely to work in the gig economy and in economically precarious jobs, um, show more pessimism about their personal finances in the coming year. We're also seeing pessimism among Japanese Americans, and that's something worth paying attention to when we talk about the economy and what the economic situation will be throughout this year. Next slide. We also see some differences by gender. So women are more likely to say that personal finances will get somewhat worse or much worse this year than men. And we see some variation by age, but it's not a clean measure, right? So you see essentially where you see the greatest anxieties among those age 18 to 34. But you also see that anxiety with other groups, with perhaps only those age 50 to 64 showing a little less worry and concern. And then partisanship matters. Largely, you see Republicans um, that are not as worried about their personal finances in the coming year when compared to Democrats and independents. Next slide. So we're going to take a deep dive into healthcare, and here are some of the key takeaways. One, APIs are more concerned about affordable healthcare than having healthcare at all. Next, affording healthcare or medication is an issue that all age groups are worried about. So this includes 68% of those 18 to 34, as well as 68% of those 65 and over. And then finally, there's more of a difference when we look at disaggregated data by political party. 80% of API independents are concerned about healthcare affordability, compared to 58% of API Republicans. So let's just see some of those numbers. So concern over healthcare costs, right? You see that costs are the biggest concerns as opposed to losing or not having health insurance. This makes sense given the big increases in premiums we saw, especially those who were covered under the Affordable Care Act. There was a lot of news coverage of this when the survey was taken. And this remains true today because Congress has not found a way to reduce those healthcare premiums. Next slide. When you look across groups, you see that most groups are either extremely concerned or very concerned about the cost of healthcare increasing in the coming year. Next slide. We looked at it by race and ethnicity. Here we see by age, and we see concerns across the board, right? So when it comes to having, this is in terms of losing health insurance. We also have data on healthcare costs and its variation by age, gender, and party ID. And you'll see that in the crosstabs that will be posted on our website at the end of this webinar. Next slide. So in terms of cost of affording, so I think I might have misspoken. So we had about healthcare, but then healthcare costs. But here we have costs about affording healthcare and medication. And we see heightened levels of concern across the board by race as well as by ethnicity. Next slide. And when it comes to differences by other factors like gender, age, and partisanship, we see that independents display high levels of concern about affording healthcare or medication. We also see slightly greater concern among women than men on this issue. Importantly, while some may think of young people as seemingly invincible, we see 41% of those age 18 to 34 as extremely concerned or very concerned about affording healthcare or medication. Next slide. Next, we'll dive a little bit deeper in terms of AAPI beliefs about American identity and how that might pertain to religion. Let's go to the next slide. So the key takeaways. So this is a major struggle within the Republican Party and among movement conservatives more generally. Some of you may have seen Vivek Ramaswamy's op-ed in the New York Times pushing back pretty hard on those elements on the right that argue that American identity is fundamentally a Christian identity. that we are a nation built on Christian ideals rather than civic ideals, regardless of religion. So we asked a question about this, about what are the fundamental aspects of US identity. And the key takeaways are that APIs are more likely to view civic ideals as essential to American identity than shared values, shared cultural values, or being a capitalist economy or having a Christian identity. The importance of Christian culture to national identity is much lower among younger AAPIs, among Democrats, and among those who are not Christians themselves. Next slide. So this was a question, this was a battery question, so multiple items. And the way the question is worded, if you see it at the bottom, how important is each of the following to the United States identity as a nation? And we see that civic ideals, including having a democratically elected government and individual liberties and freedoms as defined by the US Constitution, they are at the top, right? 80% say that these are extremely important or very important about the identity of the United States as a nation. When it comes to culture, you see a drop off. And even among culture, people are more likely to say the mixing of cultures and values from around the world is extremely important and very important than saying that shared American culture and set of values as extremely or very important. At the very bottom is this minority belief in America, but something that is growing in the conservative movement is this notion of a culture grounded in Christian religious beliefs as essential to US identity. Next slide. So we dug deeper into where some of this variation might appear, and we see some differences by ethnicity. So you see that Asian Indians, who are the most religiously diverse among Asian American groups, to say that Christian culture is not very important or not important at all when it comes to US identity. But you see across the board, close to a majority or greater than a majority, but there are some differences, and they largely depend on the distribution of Christians within each of these groups. So it might not be surprising to see that among Korean Americans, only 42% say this is not very important or not important at all. Also, importantly, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, where we know that Christian religious identity is important for many of these communities, you see 44% say it's not very important or not important at all. But across the board, it is a minority that, and a small minority in most cases, that say this is extremely important or very important. Next slide. When it comes to gender, age, and party ID, we see the greatest differences by party identification on this measure, but we also see some important differences by age. Those aged 18 to 34 are those most likely to say that it's not very important or not important at all, right, when it comes to Christian values as a basis of of national identity. And there's less of, I guess, opposition to that notion among those age 65 plus. Next slide. Finally, as you might imagine, one's own religious affiliation matters. So those who are Protestants, Christians, and Catholics, a little over a third, 37%, say that it's extremely important or very important aspect. Christian culture is a very important aspect of US identity. But those who have no religious affiliation, only 9% say the same, and 11% of those who belong to other religious traditions. So this is going to be important as this debate continues to rage, certainly within the conservative movement, but as we approach the 250th anniversary of the United States. Next slide. We also have some important questions on rights and freedoms, and this is going to be the final set of findings. So the key takeaways: freedom of speech and freedom of press are much greater concerns than threats on the right to vote and freedom of religion. We will be tracking this. It's quite likely that concerns about threats to the right to vote will increase as we approach the November midterm elections. Importantly, on all these freedoms, APIs are more concerned than the US average on these threats. And then finally, women, older APIs, and Democrats show the highest levels of concern. So let's go to the next slide. So when it comes to freedom of speech and press, you see that 58% and 57% respectively see these as major threats currently facing the United States. And those are significantly higher than the US average. The right to vote and the right and attacks on the freedom of religion are less likely to be seen as major threats when compared to the ones above. Let's go to the next slide. So digging a little bit deeper into some of these threats, seeing threats to the right to vote, we see some differences here, and especially among those who are language minorities, such as Korean Americans and Chinese Americans, you see higher levels of concern about threats to the right to vote. Let's go to the next slide. We also see greater concern among Democrats than among Republicans. It's worth watching independents, especially as we go later on this year, where they stand. But even though only 22% see it as a major threat, if you add that among and those who see it as a minor threat, you get over a majority seeing that as a threat facing the country. When it comes to age breakdowns, you don't see a significant pattern, although I guess at least would you see a heightened concern among those age 18 to 34, and then a little bit of a drop off, but you see the highest levels of concern among those age 65 plus. We also see greater concern among women than among men when it comes to threats to the right to vote. Next slide. In terms of threats to the freedom of religion, you see greater concern among Asian Indians than among other ethnic groups. And let's go to the next slide. And you see greater concern among women and among Democrats on these issues. Next slide. Threats to the freedom of speech, you see concerns across the board, but especially high concerns among Filipinos, Japanese Americans, and Korean Americans. And let's go to the next slide. And we see concerns across the board when it comes to age, but heightened concerns among those age 65 plus and among those 18 to 34. And you also see slightly greater concern among women than among men, and definitely greater concern among Democrats than among independents or Republicans. Next slide. So with that, I'll turn it back to Sarah, who will bring our speakers for a moderated discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Karthik. This is incredible data. I'm just watching your presentation, making notes vigorously, because this is, of course, the beginning of an incredibly pivotal and consequential election year. People's thoughts about the economy, about freedoms and rights are very essential to the outcome of elections. So no doubt we have a whole lot to get into here. It's my pleasure to introduce one more time our experts from the community that will be giving some feedback on this data that we're seeing and lead us in a discussion on some of this. Bob Sakaniwa from API Vote, the Director of Policy and Advocacy. Welcome, Bob. And Greg Orton, National Council of Asian Pacific Americans. Perhaps we can start just with both of you on some of your initial feedback, initial and immediate reaction to some of these findings that we have in front of us today. Certainly, things are looking quite pessimistic for APIs. Wondering what your initial feedback might be. Bob, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Thanks so much, Sarah. And thanks again for having me on, Karthik. I think this is really insightful and informative data that, as we all see, if Chair Meng is using it, it is certainly getting to the right places. I think everything we went through just now with the slides rings true to me. One of the things Karthik said at the top, excuse me, I think we should really keep in mind, which is this took place in December, early December. That is before all the terrible events we've seen happen in Minnesota. It's before the U.S. Went into Venezuela and plucked out their leader, as bad as he might be. And so, if we did the exact same thing today, I just think we would see much even more dramatic results. But again, everything kind of rings true from what we're seeing on the ground. And I think, I'm especially interested in addressing some of the findings in the voting and voting rights section there, but I'll pass it on to Greg for now.
Great. Thanks for that, Bob. Greg, you're in an AAPI serving organization. From your perspective, what does this data mean for you and for your work, and what are your initial reactions?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Good to see you. Good to see everybody else. Karthik, thanks for always having us join. Yeah, I think one of the things that really stands out to me is just this pessimism, right? We have been pessimistic for quite some time now in terms of how the community is viewing a lot of the decisions that are being made by the Trump administration, bills that are being passed by Congress. And it shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody that as decision makers in Washington, D.C. continue to make decisions based on, I suppose, their own ideological view of how the United States should look or what economic policy should look like when it does not fundamentally include our communities, which it hasn't. This pessimism is only going to continue to grow. And so, as sobering as these findings are, as concerning as all the circumstances that we're witnessing out in everyday life right now are, this doesn't come as a surprise. If you look at the track record of the Trump administration and what their policy priorities have been, it really centers around a domestic bill that took billions of dollars out of domestic spending for healthcare and education and housing and put it directly towards tax cuts that largely benefited the richest Americans in the country. Now, I don't know. When you have a policy platform that basically centers around that, there's no surprise there why many Americans, millions of Americans, feel like they're not a part of this progress that we keep hearing about from the White House every single day. And so, it really reflects our need as community organizations to continue to do this kind of community education and engagement to make sure people are aware of what's really happening, but also really, making sure that the truth gets out there. There is a narrative that the White House is pushing. There's a narrative that members of Congress are pushing. And more it feels like that's disconnected from the lived experiences of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Greg. Bob, I know you wanted to jump in on voting, but before we get there, I think Greg teed us up really, really well on some of these economic concerns and concerns about these rising costs of healthcare. I'm wondering if you want to just tell us a little bit about these economic concerns. These are the top priorities across both AAPI Democrats and Republicans. I'm curious, how can APIA Vote use this shared concern to engage voters who might feel that the federal government's unable to be making progress on this? Certainly, at this point, we're facing a potential another government shutdown.
That's right. I think in any election cycle, I think it always ends up boiling down to the economy and how it's impacting the individual. That is always going to be first and foremost in people's minds. And I first heard about this back when the phrase "it's the economy, stupid," or actually I don't remember the phrase. I might be paraphrasing there, but that's what bread and butter.
Oh,
that's
an exact quote, Bob. That's James Carville from
That's right.
1992. So
thank you. It kind of belies our age a little bit, but anyways, I think it's clear that these issues that hit home are really what people care about when they go to the voting booth. And as Greg had just said, the truth needs to come out. And so for us to mobilize our communities, I think it's incumbent upon us to connect the dots, to really explain and make sure people understand why things are happening the way they're happening, what the causes are, what the policy decisions are that are driving these outcomes. the Supreme Court is poised to come down on a decision regarding the president's ability to impose the tariffs he's been imposing. And it could go, any which way. And I'm not a trade or economy expert, but I do know that, one of the big issues behind this case is, the extent of leeway the Supreme Court's going to give to the president. How much more are they going to let the president claim is within his right to do? And so, if they go too far in that direction, it's really going to be a frightening situation for all of us. But if they do what they many people feel they should be doing, which is limiting presidential power, regardless of party or who's in office, then I think the results, with the tariffs will kind of make clear that, that wasn't the right direction. Maybe that'll ease some of the economic pressures that were mentioned earlier in our Asian grocery markets and places where, imported goods are feeling some of the worst impacts of these willy-nilly tariffs that are being imposed. So I think, again, just going back to your original question, we will mobilize our communities by making sure we have robust voter education regarding these issues and why they're happening.
Perfect, thanks. I want to just remind those who are in attendance of the webinar, please submit your questions in the Q&A section. We're going to move to audience questions in just a moment, so be sure to post questions that you have, anything that's burning on your mind, let us know, and we'll do our best to get to you. Before we do that, though, I definitely do want to pick up on this notion of the rights and the freedoms. I thought it was really fascinating. The audience, 84% said equal protection under the law. 82% said right to assemble peacefully were the top concerns for them, which was a little bit different from what AAPIs were saying back in December with the freedom of speech and freedom of press in the survey. Greg, what are you seeing on the ground? I mean, my guess is our audience is going to be reflecting these kinds of changes. You mentioned a little bit about what's happening in Minnesota, in Minneapolis right now. What are you kind of seeing on the ground? What's the reaction from NCAPA? What kinds of things will the NCAPA coalition be pushing for, perhaps in response to this, or minimally, at least to be thinking about the concerns of these rights and freedoms that AAPIs are feeling in this moment?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And I'll take this question sort of in two parts. One is sort of the immediate response, and then the more global response that we as a community really are grappling with. And so first, kind of a more localized, sort of time-sensitive response is Congress is currently grappling over how to keep the government open. We talked about the government shutdown deadline that is looming in a few days. Department of Homeland Security appropriations is a part of this debate, and within that is $10 billion more dollars for ICE, right? And ICE is the federal agency right now that is perpetrating much of the harm and violence along with the Border Patrol in communities across this country. And so there's been a really remarkable sort of movement afoot by civil rights organizers, immigration advocates, to really challenge Congress to not just rubber stamp this agenda of violence against American citizens. And so conversations are happening right now. We're not quite sure how this all plays out, but it's a great example of what is possible when communities actually are willing to organize and advocate and make their voices heard in Washington, D.C. And it's not just, community organizations like NCAPA and our members, it's everyday Americans taking the time to call their representatives saying, look, I don't think we should spend $10 billion more dollars in taxpayer dollars on ICE without major reforms. Look, some people want to abolish ICE, some people want major reforms, some people want other things. The important thing is that we weigh in now, because giving $10 billion to ICE without any kinds of changes is only going to ensure that they continue this kind of violence. I would also point out that in Trump's big, beautiful bill, whatever you want to call it, there was already $75 billion for ICE, which made it the largest law enforcement agency in the country. And so this kind of advocacy really does matter. And I know there's so many examples over the last 12 months where it feels like what we do doesn't matter because we have an administration and executive branch willing to push the limits of presidential power. We actually can. And this is a great example of it. And so the more we can tap into that, the more we can build that muscle memory over the course of this year and beyond, it really allows us to provide that check that we hoped Congress would provide, but clearly we need to push Congress to do their job too. And that isn't to knock our friends in KPAC and other members who are doing that, but collectively as a body, Congress absolutely has to do more. And so that's on us. And so more globally speaking, certainly the attacks on freedom that we've seen across the country, Minnesota and Minneapolis has been the focal point over the last few days. We have to not let this be normalized, right? I think a lot of us initially were shocked by the scale of it, by the harm, by the callousness. But my belief is certainly is that this administration is hoping that people accept this as business as usual, that eventually becomes a normalized thing. And when we allow that to happen, they will continue to do these things. And so it is about engaging our community. It's about taking the time within your own life to sit down with family members and friends and have these conversations. I know we don't like talking about politics, but we have to talk about the politics that are happening in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we're seeing at this point is it's impacting every community, right? It's not just Latinos, it's not just Asian Americans, it's all Americans who are most certainly being impacted in this moment. So thank you for that. Karthik, I wanted to bring you into this conversation. You know, you're the data guy here, the data guru for us. Based on the data that you're seeing, what are your thoughts? I mean, how might concerns about attacks on rights and freedoms play a role as we lead up to the midterm elections, especially when we're comparing them to concerns about affordability, right? It is the economy, stupid, right? So how do you see that playing out over the next several months as we move towards November?
Thanks, Sarah. And yeah, what I would say is that, yes, so, right, so that notion of the economy being predominant, that's a truism to some extent. But let's go back, let's think about midterm elections. Midterm elections are different from presidentials, right? And in 2022, people thought that that Democrats would lose tremendously, right? But they didn't. And why not? Right? It was abortion rights, reproductive rights had a huge galvanizing effect, right? And in many ways, in hindsight, people think maybe that was part of the miscalculation of the Biden team, thinking that it was some kind of positive mandate for another Biden term, as opposed to rights and freedoms playing a targeted role in that election. So that's something I want to flag that yes, affordability, like it's people always think about that last election. So they're looking at New York, Mamdani, affordability. It's going to be affordability, affordability, affordability. It very well might be. I mean, if the economy tanks, the economy will be supreme. But things that are happening in Minneapolis in terms of attacks on rights and freedoms, not just as an immigration issue, but more fundamental freedoms. This fight that's happening within the conservative movement about what it means to be American, we very well might see a big increase in hate incidents against our community. So I just want to flag all of that is to say, of course, affordability. We're seeing that in the data. It's coming out of the November elections, but also people seeing their premiums going up, and this being a big part of the conversation. But I think rights and freedoms will likely play a role. But the big thing when it comes to midterms, and it's in one of the questions in the chat, is about motivating turnout, right? And we know that turnout historically has been low in our communities, and especially among younger Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. What is it going to take to increase turnout? Well, we saw big increases in turnout in 2018. That was largely seen as a referendum on the Trump administration. So it's possible we're going to see something like that. But who knows? Maybe people are exhausted. So this is where different emotions come in. And that's something that we know in political science. People are paying more and more attention to the role of emotions as mobilizing forces and demobilizing forces. Um, but it's in all likelihood, this is probably going to be a base mobilization election as opposed to a persuasion election because turnout tends to be lower. So you're not going to have a lot of those people on the fence not knowing how they're going to vote and saying, I have to vote in November the way it is in a presidential election. So those are all dynamics I think that we need to keep in mind, but certainly to pay attention to those kind of flashing signs that we're seeing on rights to threats to various rights and freedoms.
Yeah, that's right. Right. You mentioned 2018, that was known as the blue wave, in which we saw a lot of very, very competitive congressional seats getting flipped. I think a key component to think about there is a lot of those competitive seats don't exist anymore. We don't have the level of competition that we maybe did previously. You mentioned
By the way, I'll just plug you back. It says Sarah Sadhwani, former chair of the California Redistricting Commission. But yes, with the redistricting we're
but
seeing
also
since that
supporter of
cycle.
um, you mentioned the younger voters. We did have a question about that from Cam in the Q&A. So I wanted to uplift that, and I'm wondering if Bob, you want to jump in and talk a little bit about younger voters and the role you think that they might play. Cam mentioned that in 2024 the younger electorate voter turnout was 20 points lower than the 65 plus group. What are you seeing? What are you anticipating? She mentioned some of the work she's involved with in Florida. Curious where your group is at and thinking about for younger voters.
I mean, I think energizing young voters is critical. Oftentimes, we talk about how the AAPI community itself is a, you know, uh, uh, there are enough AAPI voters in battleground states to make up the margin of victory, but that doesn't happen unless there's energy throughout the entire community, and um, the youth and young voters are essential and energizing in that context. And I do think there's a contrast between 2024 and even though it's a much smaller sample, what happened in 2025 with the New Jersey, Virginia, New York City, and that boiled down to uh, exciting and energizing and speaking to the voters themselves, meeting them where they're at. And I think that doesn't mean a cookie cutter approach that might have worked for Mandami, might work for others, but there may be a different approach needed in other parts of the country as well. So um, what it boils down to retail politics, getting into your community, speaking to folks, and really listening and coming up with solutions that underscore the fact that you were listening to them. So and I think youth voters are a huge uh, factor in getting energy into this midterm election cycle.
Yeah, great. In the time we have remaining, we have a couple questions about healthcare. So I just want to bring that back around to the conversation. One person was asking a little bit about what in the data are the driver of healthcare cost concerns. Is it the ACA premiums that are rising? Is it news about the costs? Is it the survey timing and the proximity to all of the enrollment periods? Do we have some sense about what might be driving it? And there had been an earlier question also from Cam about, the fundamental questions of healthcare. Yes, of course, bring down the costs, but oftentimes, and I think we hear this over and over again, in particular for young people, there's a lot of folks out there who want fundamental change, bigger changes to the system than just going back and ensuring the premiums are there. How do we respond to that? So there's on the one hand the data question. I'll give that to you, Karthik, and if Greg or Bob, you want to jump in on the broader question about these big reforms that it seems the electorate is really looking for.
Yeah, one thing I'll say about the data, it's, we didn't ask follow-on questions to be able to dig deeper, but I think the timing of the survey, I think one thing that'll be interesting to see is, November, December is when people need to figure out their healthcare for the coming year, most people, right? And that with open enrollment. And so that'll be fascinating to see if there's that a kind of seasonality as opposed to like a congressional fight. So this is like a future political science study that needs to be far more sophisticated to be able to dig deeper. I do think, Greg, I don't know. I mean, part of it's, there are NCAPA organizations that specialize on healthcare issues. So maybe there's an opportunity in the future, not only with survey data, but in future community briefings as NCAPA is stepping up in their role. Final thing I'll say, wearing my political scientist hat on federalism, I mean, yeah, if some people are like burn the whole thing down and do single payer everywhere, and some people are like, no, that is crazy. That's not what we're signing up for. Hopefully, I mean, in other divided society, when you see societies with extreme polarization, devolution of powers to the states is probably the best way because we cannot agree at the national level, right, in terms of what the solution needs to be. So that's something potentially to pay attention to, and especially if there's a big intergenerational divide that is opening up in the country, maybe we can have some sorting at the state level. So there are certain states that are enacting healthcare policy that are more to people's liking, and companies and firms and people can move there, and then others can move to other states. It just seems like the only viable solution, other than us like getting half the country getting super angry when a different party comes into power at the national level.
Instructive. Bob or Greg, any final thoughts on these healthcare questions?
Yeah, with the time remaining, I'll say this. The public option was a big push during the Affordable Care Act when it was being considered over a decade ago. It didn't make it because to Karthik's point, there wasn't enough agreement that that was actually a viable vehicle. I will say that in states that have public options, that we have seen costs come down. So that is at least one solution that could be considered. But the reality is, as long as our economy is built on vertical integration, which means these big healthcare companies keep buying up parts of the supply chain and allowing them to find savings there and drive up their profits. It's a real challenge, and we have to figure out some way to either blunt that or restructure that entirely. And so that's a real big question that Congress and future leadership's going to have to face. I will say that the current White House and Republicans in Congress insist that they will be moving their version of healthcare reform. We haven't quite seen what that looks like. There's been a lot of talk. There hasn't been as much concrete substance yet. So we'll see where that leads. But the truth is that even under the Affordable Care Act, there was an effort to basically cap how much insurance companies could spend on premiums related to overhead and profits versus actual care. That was well intentioned, but that also incentivized a lot more of this integration that we're seeing now, which is driving up costs. And so there does have to be some real tough conversations about how we restructure this entire industry in some ways if we're really going to put ourselves back on that path towards affordable care, because there's just so many dynamics right now that are at play. You can't necessarily solve for one without creating sort of a ripple effect that's being felt in other parts of the industry. And so, we don't have time to do a deep dive. I would love to, Karthik. I think it's a great idea. We have groups like APCHO and, the South Asian Public Health Association, as well as others within our coalition that are experts in this. And, their view on these long-term solutions are a big part of how we shape our collective response.
Great. Thanks so much. Bob, any final words for you before we have to wrap
I,
up?
I think Greg and Karthik really covered it well. So I'm good. Thanks.
One quick thing I'm going to ask Sarah, and maybe for Bob, this could be this one thing that just came in the Q&A, and I don't know if you're positioned to answer this. I don't know, Sarah, if you can read that, just about college students and where they should be voting. And Sarah, you have expertise in geographic districts and voting. So, we don't want to give legal advice here, but maybe just some strategy advice, Sarah, both you and Bob. I think it's worth lifting up that question.
For college students, I think it's ultimately their choice where they want to vote. The most important part is to actually go out and vote. There's always options, but just be forewarned that each state has different laws about how one can go cast a ballot, how long they might have to be registered before actually being able to cast a ballot. So I think the most important thing is for students to be educated about what their options are and what they actually have to do to be able to cast their ballot, because those laws change significantly from state to state. California has really broad open access to the ballot, but other states are much more closed. Certainly if folks want to think about, voting in more competitive districts and races, that is ultimately their choice. But the most important part is to go out and exercise that right. Bob, any other thoughts? You're the voting.
No, I think that's 100% correct. I would say that because there are so many different rules and jurisdictions approach voter eligibility differently, it's not something you want to get too cute with. We know this administration doesn't even want to have a midterm election, so they're collecting voter rolls. They're trying to weed out people who they think are not citizens, but we know the databases they're using are not intended for that purpose, and so the more you kind of mess around, the more chance that you have of getting inadvertently knocked off a voter roll. So yeah, I would say just be very clear what the specific rules are, like you said, Sarah, and go from there.
Yep. Perfect. We are out of time for today, but I want to thank everyone for coming out and joining us for all of this incredible data and information about the AAPI community. We know so many folks are out there doing fantastic work to uplift the voices of communities across the country. So thanks so much for your engagement and participation in today's briefing. Please continue to stay up to date on the latest findings at AAPI Data and the AP-NORC websites. And of course, reach out with any questions. My sincerest thanks to our experts today, Bob Sakaniwa, Greg Orton, and Karthik Ramakrishnan. And of course, a big thanks to Congresswoman Grace Meng for joining us earlier today. Thanks to everyone and have a great day.